Good morning, good mid-morning. I'm Chris Mackin, teach at Rutgers, do this work, an old friend of this gentleman who I started working with in 1977, if you can believe that. But let's, in terms of the chronology here, let's push Dr. Ellerman off stage for a second, because we have Carol Pateman, who's going to be commenting on David's work, and hopefully Robert Hawken from Cornell, if he makes it in. His last message is that he's arrived in California, which is not terribly specific, but we hope it's Southern California. But I'd ask Carol, I know there are at least a half a dozen, I bet you more. How many of you were introduced to these ideas in part through Carol Pateman's book, Participation in Democratic Theory? Look at that. So it's wonderful that Joseph was able to recruit Carol to comment. The book was published in 1970. The Beatles were still playing music. And many of us got our start here. But David really needs not much of an introduction, but there's some new people here, I suppose. He's a PhD in math, master's in economics, and a master's in philosophy. Has been teaching in economics, in math, in accounting, in political theory since the 70s, but also maintaining a strong practical bent in doing this work, first with some colleagues and I in mostly the northeast part of the United States, but around the country with the Industrial Cooperative Association. David Hammer is here, who's a successor. Newell Lascelles was here yesterday, who worked at that nonprofit that we started in 1977. David moved on to work, do various teaching things, but then moved to Eastern Europe to work on privatizations of state-owned firms, to employee ownership, engaged in some very colorful public debates with the Harvard Wunderkinders, with Jeff Sachs and Larry Summers and so forth. Maybe we can get David to talk about that, if not in this session, over cocktails later today. But David has maintained a connection between theory and practice, is the point I'm trying to make. And the last part of his formal career was as a speechwriter for Joseph Stiglitz at the World Bank, where I believe he taught Joe a thing or two about economics, and about how to understand what went on in Russia and various other places. So this is a broad spectrum of work, and I don't know how David's going to... I think David is sort of telescoping in, zeroing in on a small part of his work that he assumes would hit the middle ground here with this audience, but how about a round of applause and a welcome.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Joe, for arranging this, and thank you, Carol, for coming. And yeah, I'm going to focus on the sort of legal structure issues that were central to our practice at the ICA, and I was sort of the theoretician, and Chris and Steve Dawson and others were the practitioners. And so some things become clear in mixing together sort of theory and practice over the years. So I want to sort of complicate the discussion about ownership, that so often these debates take place on a very simplistic level that treat a human organization simply as a piece of property to be owned, and then they debate about should it be privately owned or state-owned or socially owned or employee-owned or broad-based owned, and don't even question the whole treatment of an organization, human beings, as a piece of property. So that's where I'm going to start, is what other sorts of rights are there that aside from property rights, and what's the real difference, and how might you, in an ideal way, restructure a company as a worker-owned company. So I'm starting off here with this distinction, fundamental distinction between property rights and the sort of broad category which I call personal rights, but the rights that we have because you qualify for them as a person. So why are you voting in wherever you live in the municipality? Well, you have to qualify for that by residing within that municipality. You don't have to own property, but you have to reside there. And it's not a right that you have to buy from somebody, and it's not a right that you can sell to somebody. So it's a different type of right than an ownership right. And we had de Tocqueville talking about the great strength of early America was in all these associations. Well, how do you become a member of an association? Typically, you had to play some role. So I picked the Veterans of Foreign Wars as a role, that you have to be a veteran in the foreign war to belong to that association. Of course, cooperatives are based on this principle as well, that each different type of cooperative has a different notion of patronage, and patronage means you have to patronize that cooperative by either working there in a worker co-op or consuming there in a consumer co-op or selling your agricultural produce to a marketing co-op and so forth. So these are all personal rights that you qualify for, and the most general category would be human rights. Whereas a property right is something where there's no qualifying role. You can sort of think of it as the limit case, where the qualifying role to have the right goes to zero, so anybody can own a piece of property that can afford it and buy it. There's no other additional role that you have to buy. So it's important to understand the difference between these two types of rights, that the whole idea of selling a personal right, where the idea is to identify that right with a certain role, doesn't even make sense, because if you don't have the role and buying it would then violate that correlation between having the right to play that functional role. And if you have the functional role, then you get the right for that reason, you don't have to buy it. So there's a whole difference between these two different types of rights, the ones which we identify with our citizenship rights in America or other countries or municipality or organizations. So the sort of criteria is marketability, number one. It doesn't make sense to have personal rights marketable because you disassociate the role and the right, and inheritability, that when you die, is the right the sort of thing that will pass on to your estate. And when you die, your house or your car will go to your estate, but your voting right wherever you live doesn't. Your spouse does not get two voting rights when you die. So there's a very clear legal distinction between these two different types of rights, and this plays into the whole idea of how we restructure companies, in one way or the other. Often it's very much in the background. So we have sort of two different types of associations. The association, which is where the people that are members of it, we would use the word membership typically or citizen, and where the membership is a personal right based on functional role, or where you sort of take that functional role, take the limit as it goes to zero, and then you just get a property right that anybody can own. And that's the sort of more conventional corporation is that side. Where membership, you still call the shareholders members, but it's clearly a property right, and anybody who can afford the shares or is even given the shares or inherits the shares is equally a member. There's no other qualification that's necessary for that. So those two different sort of extremes. So the question is, when you have the idea of a democratic firm or worker-owned firm, whatever language you want to assume here, the idea is that membership in the firm is attached to the role of working in the firm. That's the fundamental concept. And how do you implement that institutionally, organizationally, legally, and in particular, what happens to the capital rights in the firm? Because now you have the membership in the firm is based on working there, so as always, it's not something you buy, you have to qualify for it, not something you can sell to somebody else. Then what happens to the capital rights in particular from the reinvested earnings? And I'm going to go through sort of a typology of different types of worker-owned companies, and according to how they answer this question, because it turns out to be one of the crucial questions, is you're working in a firm, the idea sort of is that the people who work in the firm should be the members of the firm, but you don't pay everything out as net income, you retain some income. So what happens to that retained income? Do you have any recoupable claim on that retained income? And when people talk about a nonprofit corporation, for example, that's a misnomer because a nonprofit corporation can have any goal it wants, basically. We're not talking about a tax exemption, just a nonprofit corporation, but you cannot recoup in any way what you reinvest in the firm, which you don't pay out as salary. There's nothing like a share that you can sell that has a certain value in a nonprofit corporation. So there have been a lot of co-ops that have been organized essentially as nonprofit corporations. And even in Yugoslavia, where I moved to in 1990, to try to implement something like the ESOP or co-op in their privatization plans, they were all organized as so-called social firms. And social firm is sort of a soft form of a state firm, but it wasn't necessarily the national state that had the ownership. It could have been the county or the local municipality. And so you had sort of worker self-management at a firm level, but once the firms got into trouble and so forth, then the local municipality or county would step in and basically take over the firm. So at the end of the day, it was government owned in that sense. And certainly when it came time to privatize, everything was renationalized without fundamental objection, and then just sold off in a more conventional sense, or shares just put on the stock market. So the Yugoslavs never solved this problem of how to handle this retained earnings, in other words, the capital rights in the firm, if the membership rights are personal rights. So that's the question. If you start splitting these rights up and have some of the rights, membership treated as personal rights, then what happens to these capital rights? And the economists, those of you trained in economics, this is called the Faribault-Pejovic horizon problem, that when you are a member of such a firm and making an investment decision, say you're going to buy a machine and the machine will last 10 years, if you're going to be in the firm more than 10 years, then it's not a problem, because you will buy it, you'll depreciate it, and that's the end of it. But if you're going to retire next year and you're taking a big chunk out of your income to buy this machine, then you're going to retire next year and you've got no way to recoup that. 9/10 of the machine's value roughly is gone. And that's, so your willingness to make these reinvestments depends upon your time horizon with the firm. And so that's why Faribault and Pejovic called it the horizon problem. And we know how to solve the problem, but I want to go over some of the thinking that went in the early days of our work with worker co-ops as to how we figured out how to solve this problem. So, going back to my first involvement was with, the first worker co-op I worked with was in Brattleboro, Vermont, converting a consumer co-op called the Common Ground to a worker co-op. But prior to that, there was a company there, Paul Millman here, you may remember this, it's called Llama, Toucan, and Crow. And it was a natural foods company, and they wanted to do a sort of worker buyout there. And it was my first, this was 1975, 74, 75. And so I knew as an academic economist about this horizon problem. I had to figure out how to solve it. And so I came up with a scheme that I describe here, that we would, when we wanted to, say, reinvest $10,000, we would allocate it to the workers according to salary, on the understanding that they would invest it, they would put it in a savings account in the local bank, where we had a pre-arrangement where the money would then be loaned back to the corporation, and so then you'd buy the machine with that, and you'd pay it off over time with the usual depreciation, et cetera, but the worker now had a recoupable claim on their portion of the undepreciated machine because they had this bank account with the money there. So in that sense, we worked out a solution, but it was, of course, totally arcane and complicated. So then finally said, well, why don't we just move the savings account in the company and just run the whole thing through the company as if we were putting the money out somewhere and then borrowing it back. And that was the origin of what we call the internal capital account. And that was one of ICA's sort of big contributions, still not known by all worker co-ops, I must add, that you can reinvest in the firm and not give up your claim by having this sort of a separate internal capital account, which bears interest and is a property right. You die, the capital account goes to your heirs, but there's no connection to membership. You may kick off the account with your membership fee, but the size of the membership doesn't give you any more votes, it just gives you more interest. So it's like an internal loan in a normal corporation. An officer may make a loan to a corporation. And so this is all the workers collectively making this loan. So this essentially solved the Verizon problem. The Luma 2 Crow deal didn't actually happen, but we had a conceptual solution. And then in about 76 or so, Robert Oakeshott published his book in England called The Case for Worker Co-ops, and told us about this place called Mondragon, which none of us had ever heard of before at that time. And it turned out that's exactly the same solution that they had evolved to this problem. That Mondragon has this whole system of internal capital accounts, and that is one of the two ways in which Mondragon really differs from other cooperatives, is that they solved this decades before we had this, trying to figure out ourselves. And that's also why Mondragon can be so capital intensive, because they don't have this disincentive to reinvest. Workers aren't giving up the money that they reinvest, and so you don't have this big push. Everything has to be paid out to me now in cash, otherwise I'll lose any recoupable claim on that equity. And then we found out even later that actually this is done in partnerships all the time. That when a partnership is making some big capital investment, and you normally have this partnership income that's paid out to people, and you can't keep paying all that out and then get a loan to buy a building for your law firm or something. You have to reinvest part of those partnership earnings back into the partnership to fund that building, couple it with a loan from the bank, and so then you create a capital account in the partnership that is separate from your partnership rights. And so it doesn't give you any more voting power in the partnership. It's an interest-bearing account that the partnership eventually has to pay off. So the idea has been there, in Mondragon decades before we discovered it, and in partnerships forever and ever. And so the economists were all in their ivory tower talking about this Furbu and Payovic Verizon problem, and we had already, it had already been solved at least 3 times independently in practice. And I should add, I'll talk about some of the other types of structures that try to solve this problem unsuccessfully, but the successful way to do it is actually, as I said, 3 times. So that's internal capital accounts. It was a total coincidence that ICA, which stood for Industrial Cooperative Association, actually had the same initials as internal capital accounts, so we became known as the ICA company in 2 senses. And the other types, well, we'll go to the sort of general framework here. When you restructure a company, you design a company with a different structure, these are basically what you have to account for. What happens to these rights? The 2 fundamentally different types of rights are the rights to voting rights, which attach to the control function in the company, and then the value rights. And the value rights split between stock and flow. Now stock, I'm not using stock in the sense of corporate stock, I'm using stock in the sense of what's on the balance sheet attached to a point in time. The stock flow distinction, flow is over a period of time, income statement is an equity flow statement, and the cash flow statement is a cash flow statement. And so you have the flow rights to current income, and then you have this, and this is current and future, and then you have B2 there, which is the stock or stock value, and I don't mean corporate stock, I mean the number value of the accumulated net asset value. So this represents the retained earnings in the company that have not been depreciated away, as well as any capital you may have put in the company originally as paid-in capital or as a membership fee in a cooperative. So in a conventional corporation, all these rights are bundled together as property rights. And they can be owned by anybody, has no connection to the company and so forth. But when you start to redesign it with the idea, fundamental idea of a company where the members of the company are the people that work in the company, then this bundle of rights has to be treated in different ways. So you can sort of do a topology of the different types of worker-owned companies that we have found in practice according to how they split up this bundle of rights. So the sort of what we consider the ideal structure is where the voting rights would be like the citizenship rights, that you have to qualify for them by being in the community here that's being governed, which are the people working in the firm. So the current voting rights go to the current workers in the firm, future voting rights to the future members in the firm. So in particular, that means the future voting rights are not owned by as property that future workers have to buy. The future workers qualify for them the same way you qualified for them. And the value rights, the flow value rights, would be attached to the people working in the firm at the time, because it's the net value of the fruits of their labor, positive and negative. Positive is what they produce, negative is what they use up. It's called expenses and revenue in conventional accounting. And so the net income, and we mean the net value added here, would attach to the people that work in the firm at that point, and the future ones to the future one. But that last one is the one where the internal capital accounts came in, because that's a property right. So the voting rights and the flow rights are all treated here as a personal rights attached to working in the firm, because you're among those who are being governed, so the idea of self-government kicks in, or the value rights attached to you working in the firm. These are the fruits of your joint labor in the firm. So it was B, that B2 there, that is where the internal capital accounts kicked in. So that's sort of a benchmark type of structure that has fundamental principles behind it, and shows how to take that bundle of rights, that's all property rights in a conventional firm, chop it up, reallocate it by certain basic principles of self-government and private property, getting the fruits of your labor. And then the B2 is a property right. If you die, that's inherited by your estate. Now, let's look at some of the other structures, as I mentioned before. The idea of a nonprofit. A lot of worker co-ops seem to be organized as nonprofits, and basically just deny any right to let you reinvest in the firm, because that's what nonprofit means. It doesn't mean you're not seeking profits. It means you cannot recover retained earnings. That you have to pay that out as future wages, and so it basically just denies any recoupable claims, such as a capital account that would have to be paid out to you over time. So that's sort of like the Yugoslav socialist firm, was this idea of the nonprofit. And that has all the usual horizon problems. Tend not to be very capital intensive, because obvious disincentive to reinvest in the firm. They try to borrow for all capital investment. And one of the key things I think historically in Mondragon is that they didn't do this sort of structure. They did the internal capital accounts, so they were able to become quite capital intensive. Now, the traditional worker co-op, here I'm thinking of the plywood co-ops in the Northwest. And just to give you a little bit of history here, these were created by Scandinavian immigrants in the Northwest, I don't know, was it 20s or 30s, and used a sort of older type of structure. When we started, those of us who were children of the 60s started working on these issues, cooperative wasn't even the name that we used. The first book we published on this was a collection of essays called Workers' Control, which is a British phrase, and that was published in 1972. You had the whole academic stream. Jaroslav Vaniak is probably the best known person there, and there was called Labor Managed Market Economies, or called the Illyrian firm. Now, Illyria was the name of the Roman province that eventually became Yugoslavia, so that was an indirect reference to Yugoslavia. And the Illyrian firm theory never faced up to the capital structure problem. It always treated as if you had perfect markets, you could just go out and rent whatever machines or buildings and everything you wanted, so that the whole problem of capital investment was sort of too practical for the academic economists to contemplate. So those were called pure rental firms. And the traditional worker co-ops, well, just to finish up on that, Jaroslav Haniek then put together a collection of essays. It was published, I think, in Penguin in about '75, and that was called self-management, which was the phrase that was used in Yugoslavia. So by the mid-'70s, there wasn't even this tradition of using the word cooperative. And of course, ERISA was just being, ESOPs weren't around, that came with ERISA about the same time. So it was only in the later '70s we formed ICA and then sort of focused on the idea of worker co-ops as the way to do that. And then we'll get into the connection to ESOPs. But traditional worker co-ops have this idea that you have to have a membership share that you own to be a member. So you have to own one of these shares and you have to buy it. And you have to buy it because it carries also the retirement income. In other words, it stands for the value of the retained earnings of the members who have been there. So if you know your econometrics, you have this whole principle that you can't use one instrument for two totally different purposes. And one purpose or the other will be subverted. And so here you have this one instrument which had these two totally different purposes. One was to, as it were, assign the membership rights to working in the firm, and the other was to carry the value of the accumulated retained earnings in the firm. So what happened in the plywood co-ops is that the founding cohort would get their retirement, and each share would be tens of thousands of dollars, which was real money in those days, and new workers couldn't afford to buy that. So they would say, okay, we'll have to hire you, we need to fill the job, so we'll hire you as a non-member, and maybe someday you'll be able to get a loan or something and buy a membership share. And so then the actual members dwindled down, and eventually they would band together and sell the whole firm to a conventional firm. And so you got, again and again, you got these plywood co-ops that converted, and were forced to do that. Otherwise, they would basically lose the value that was represented by this membership share. And so these were called mule firms. A mule, cannot reproduce across a generation. And so you have to start, the mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey. But they're a sterile hybrid. So the mule firms didn't reproduce, and so we knew why. We knew because they tried to have this one share that carried these two functions, and we separate those functions. And ICA type and in the longer gone cooperatives, those functions were separated. That the membership was based upon your work in the firm. There's usually a membership probationary period, and there's usually a membership fee for psychological purposes. But the retained earnings, the bulk of what you would eventually get over time with retirement, was in a totally separate function, the internal capital account or the account in Mondragon. So this was one of the structures that we criticized, and of course that was controversial. And I would just add this story. I think Chris and Fred were there. There's another type of employee-owned firm in Spain called the SALs, which stands for Society Animalis Liberalis. And they basically come out of bankruptcies. The workers get the last chance to pick up in a bankrupt firm, and somehow they wash out the old liabilities. So you get a sort of worker-oriented Chapter 11 thing. And we asked them how they solved this problem. And it turned out they had exactly the plywood structure. They had one membership share. You had to own that to become a member. And then they say, well, how did you get your people that retire to sell the share? And they said, well, we put pressure on them to sell at a price the new workers can afford. and I said, this was in the 80s. I said, this problem is a solved problem. That you're trying to use one instrument for two totally different purposes, and you need two different instruments. And the place historically this has been solved is these guys across the street called Mondragon. And Mondragon, well, they're cooperatives, and cooperatives is a 19th century thing, whereas we are 20th century, we are new. And so you had sort of usual local politics between the SALs and Mondragon. So this understanding of how to even structure worker co-ops is by no means a done deal. Even major groups of employee-owned companies in the world, like the SALs, are still using this in fact, 19th century notion of how to structure a co-op by having this one instrument carrying the two totally different functions. Now, the next type to look at is just a conventional corporation. Now we're talking pre-ESOP. Conventional corporation where the shares happen to be owned, for the most part, by the employees. And with no ESOP structure, no trust structure, no special arrangements for leverage or any of that. And of course, there are a number of these. One of the first ones I had some involvement with was the Vermont Asbestos Group. And even you see on PBS, this fellow Paul Salmon, and he had an early experience with worker ownership. He was working for the paper in Boston, one of these weekly papers, basically all ads, but free, called the Phoenix, and the workers went on strike. And they then started a strike paper on their own called the Real Paper, because it was the real Phoenix, but they couldn't use the same name. And Paul was one of the people involved in that. And it just got into this sort of bargaining between the different people in the paper as to how many shares they could get. I'm in advertising, I'm really the key guy here, so I should get 20% or 30% of the shares, and so forth. It was just a complete mess. And the Vermont Asbestos Group was something like that as well. And just a note on the governance structure at Vermont Asbestos, the workers kept electing people to the board that would represent the blue-collar workers, and the management, one by one, would co-opt them, saying, if you show us in your board behavior and your board decisions that you think like a management, then you'll get a white hat. White hat was representative of management. And so the workers became more and more frustrated. The only board member that actually supported the workers was the guy that didn't work there, because he was the local state representative that they'd elected, because he couldn't be co-opted. So you then had the workers went on strike against their own company, as it were, and that got a lot of publicity and so forth. So those were early experiences with conventional corporations where the conventional ownership was largely in the hands of the employee without any special ESOP structure. So out of that milieu, we had the development of the ESOPs. And for many years, there was this conflict of a sort between the co-op people and the ESOP people. And I was part of a lot of debates had to do with that. And part of the problem was on our side that we tended to identify the ESOPs with the crude conventional corporations that were just owned by the workers. We didn't understand the special aspects of the ESOP trust, the special mechanisms. And what happened over the years is we learned then to appreciate part of the ESOP basis. And this slide here sort of explains why we eventually became much more friendly, because the way in which the ESOP legislation was implemented was through ERISA, and ERISA is retirement income that's based on labor. So if you look at the way it actually functions, there is a labor basis to the way in which shares are allocated. You're paying off an ESOP loan, say, and as the loan is paid off, the shares are allocated to the workers according to their labor compensation. So even though the rhetoric you hear is often very conventional rhetoric, it's all ownership and anybody can own it. In fact, the shares were attached to working in the firm and getting that labor compensation. Management could not grab all the shares because it had to be non-discriminatory. That was another part of ERISA. And if you back that up with a mandatory buyback when the workers retire, then what have you done? You basically restructured a conventional corporation using this whole ESOP to make it labor-based. I mean, there's a lot of detail difference there, but you've attached ownership to labor over time to the people working in the firm. So when we finally figured that out, realized that, then we said, well, there's not so much fundamental difference between co-ops and ESOPs in that respect. And in fact, ESOPs have a lot of advantages, not number one being the tax benefits, which are even better than the co-op tax. Co-op as a tax benefit, you got to pay one tax to the other, individual or corporate, and then in the ESOP you can actually postpone both taxes. And so that was one, but the most fundamental thing, which I've come to appreciate over the years, aside from this whole labor basis for ESOPs, is the leverage mechanism, the leverage buyout mechanism to do conversions. And we know that the reason why ESOPs have grown to whatever it is now, 10% or so of the workforce, is through conversions, not through startups. It's through converting family-owned firms. And within the years since ESOPs were put on the table, they've already outpaced the trade union movement in America, which is now like 7% or something in the workforce. So that's a very important mechanism. And I was mentioning before that I've tried to do work in East Europe and even in West Europe, and the phrase ESOP has become very important. We've had, there was a couple of years ago, there were some workers marching around the Parliament building in Zagreb holding up signs saying ESOP. And what do you mean by that? But they'd heard the phrase and they didn't really know what it meant, but they were still a state-owned firm and they wanted to buy from the state. And so we talked to the people in the ministry, in the government, and said, well, why don't we do an ESOP? And so they were just thinking ESOP just meant, employee-owned company. And they said, well, that's fine. The workers can go out and mortgage their houses and mortgage their cars and take out loans and buy the shares. And we said, no, that's not how an ESOP. An ESOP is where they buy the company through using the company itself as the leverage, as the collateral, and the earning power of the company pays off the loan in the future. They said, well, you're crazy. How can, they don't own it. How can they use it as a collateral before they own it? And so then, experiences like that really, to me, emphasize the real contribution of not only the sort of labor basis for ESOPs, but the leverage mechanism for buyout, which is as far as I know, basically unique in the world. So you get a lot of employee share purchase plans in Europe called ESOPs, but they're not really leveraged buyout mechanisms. And so that's the second reason here that you've had this entente between ESOPs and worker co-ops is the appreciation of the labor-based aspects of ESOPs. So the ownership or membership in the company stays in the current employee's hands over time, and this additional buyout mechanism by which you can leverage the assets, as it were, before you own it. And that is really spectacular. I mean, that was, to my mind, Kelso's great contribution was this idea of the leverage buyout, which has been used for a long time by rich people, but making it available through this ESOP legislation to the workers in the firm. So we are now trying to convince policymakers in Croatia, Slovenia, elsewhere, that this idea is not crazy and it's complicated. There's a lot of legislation that needs to be adapted to a very different legal environment, but it would have enormous applicability over there if we could get it implemented. So that's the sort of story of how these things came, starting from the early 70s and the co-op picture, Mondragon, traditional co-ops versus the new type of co-ops, and then the ESOPs and the eventual entente between co-ops and ESOPs represented by this group. And so I wanted to finish up by going sort of back to some of the first principles behind the reasoning. We've been talking about sort of the details of the legal structure and how you reassign the bundle of rights in a different types of employee-owned firms, which ones become property rights, which ones become personal rights, and so forth. But let's go now to some of the other broader issues, a little more academic here. But I sort of figured out there's at least 5 confusions that have to be addressed. And this gets into the whole sort of so-called corporate governance debate as well. And one confusion is everyone affected by an action should have the right to control the action. And this was even part of Robert Dahl. Robert Dahl is one of the 2 major political scientists that has really taken the workplace democracy issue. The other is Carol here. And Dahl had this affected action principle that he never quite sorted out. And it's also the basis for the so-called stakeholders, corporate governance idea. And it really confuses the positive and negative control, which is a very fundamental distinction. If I'm going to do something that affects you, your personal property, then you have the right to veto that action, saying, you can't do that to me or to my property. But that leaves, so that's negative control, but that leaves me with an infinity of other options that don't affect you at all, and there's no reason why you should have control over those, over what I do otherwise that doesn't affect you. And yet when you blur the 2 notions of positive and negative, saying those who might be affected should have control, then you blur the distinction between that positive and negative control. So yes, people on the outside of a firm should have the right to protect their interest, and that may be very imperfectly represented, but that's very different than saying they should be the board members or the owners of the firm, which is getting into positive control. And the whole idea of stakeholder governance is basically built on that confusion, that stakeholders are those that should be able to protect their affected interest, but that's very different than saying they qualify for the control, positive control function to make the decision of what the firm is going to do. So that's sort of key distinction number 1. Number 2 is this whole analogy between the electing by whoever your shareholders are, the board and of the corporation. And so this is a quote from a Harvard Law School professor, Abram Shays, and the analogy between the state and the corporation. So the board of directors is like the legislature, and the citizens are like the shareholders, and ta-da. And often you get this idea that well, it'd be great if it worked. And the point that Shays makes, and the point that's obvious, is no, it's not a problem. It doesn't work. The problem is that the shareholders are not the ones that are governed. So it's like you went through a whole procedure to have the people in Russia elect the government of Poland, and ran parties and ran elections and so on, but the people that are elected weren't going to govern the people in Russia, they're going to govern the people in Poland. You say, well, isn't that democracy? We elected the government. No, the people who were governed were not the ones electing the government. The people on the outside who had these shares were the ones. So the whole analogy that this is democracy at all breaks down. And it's not a matter of it doesn't work in principle. Of course, it doesn't work in principle either, because the shareholders sell their shares if they're dissatisfied, typically, in a widely held company. So that's another part of the, you've got all sorts of people working on corporate governance issues and saying, well, we just need to empower the absentee shareholders more, and that will solve the problems. And no, that's not even in principle solves a democracy problem, deficit of democracy. And this third confusion, our second commentator, Robert Hockett, is not here, and this sort of slide was for him. There is a few academic writers that try to draw a very simplistic analogy between a conventional corporation and a they may think I was a labor-managed firm, and where just interchange the role of capital and labor. And the person I'm thinking of here is the professor at Yale, Henry Hensman, who was on Hockett's PhD panel. And Henry has published this book called The Ownership of Enterprise, and trying to argue that the conventional corporation is just like a capital cooperative. In other words, the idea of different types of cooperatives, you have this functional role called patronage in this case. So patronage, a worker co-op is working in it, patronage in a housing co-op is living in it, patronage in a consumer co-op is buying your stuff there. And patronage in a credit cooperative is depositing your money there, and similarly for a mutual insurance company and so forth. So Hensman tried to make this argument that a conventional corporation is just a capital cooperative, that the role, that patronage role is investing your capital in it. And so there are huge problems with this theory. And the first one of which is that most shareholders are secondary or tertiary or tenthary shareholders. They didn't invest in it. The people long ago invested in it. And secondly, there's no reason that you have to pay capital for shares. You can be given shares as a hiring bonus. You can be given shares as a normal bonus, as in these stock option things. You can inherit shares and so forth. So there's an actual disconnect between the supplying of capital to a conventional corporation and this whole analogy with capital suppliers cooperating breaks down when you think about it. The other person that was thinking along this line is an academic economist, Gregory Dow, and as a KMF versus LMF, the capital managed firm versus the labor managed firm. And once again, this sort of academic economist that doesn't really bother to learn about the actual legal structure, but likes the sort of symmetry of the two things. So, and I think the Hensman idea is more significant because it shows that you can be a famous law professor at Yale Law School and not even understand a corporation, how it works. And the correct theory of the conventional corporation is you take the idea of a cooperative and a certain role of patronage, and you just take the limit as patronage goes to zero. So when patronage goes to zero, then the voting rights and the value rights become free-floating rights because they're not attached to anything, and then you can get them for whatever reason. You can buy them, you can you can inherit them, you can give them as a bonus and whatever, and that's what the conventional corporation is. It's the limit, as it were, of the cooperative where the personal aspects of the rights have been squeezed out, and the voting and the value rights that in a Mondragon cooperative would be attached to the role of working in the firm have become general free-floating rights. And of course the capital rights are there as property rights, as they should be in the conventional corporation. So that's the idea there. It's the patronage-free cooperative, as it were. And that is why the conventional corporation has such universality, because anybody can own it. And there's no attachment to anybody. And so it's become a very adaptable legal frame to all sorts of things. But you get into the academic literature, you get these other crazy theories there. And the fourth confusion here is, this goes back to a broader debate in political theory, but the idea is standard sort of classical liberalism, or what Europeans might call libertarianism, is that consent is the fundamental necessary condition, and to some extent even sufficient condition on a social arrangement, is that people consent to it, as opposed to coercion. And it turns out that if you really look at the history of these debates, consent was always assumed, that monarchies were justified. The theory of divine right was fine for those people that believed that, but the real theory was that there is a social contract by which the people, over time, by the prescription of time, have transferred the right to govern to the monarch, and if they're not, in open revolt. And so the social contract was a contract of alienation, where they transferred the right to government. So it wasn't justified as being coercive. It was justified as saying, in fact, is based on consent. And so when you look at the development of democratic political theory, it didn't develop by saying, gee whiz, we should have consent, because that was the traditional justification, that the people gave up their right to govern and transferred that to the prince in the lex regia in Roman law, for example. So the real distinction was, yes, consent, but not consent to alienation, but consent to delegation. That you don't give up, you don't transfer the rights of self-government, but you delegate the exercise of them to representatives or trustees in some governance arrangement, and those who govern then govern in your name. So you are governed in the name of those who are governed, which is very different than a system where you agree to transfer, to alienate your rights to self-government, and then the sovereign or the ruler or the manager or the employer does not govern in your name, and not as your representative, not as your trustee. So there's a lot of political theory where people just fudge this issue. They just say everybody has to give up these rights. They don't say whether give up in the sense of alienate or give up in the sense of delegate, which are two totally different things. And so there's a lot of confusion in political theory, and I can mention, for example, Quentin Skinner has these two books on the foundations of modern political theory, and he's very good on this, and he understands quite well. He goes over each of the traditional thinkers and sees how they come down on this issue of alienation versus delegation. And the key move there was in the late Middle Ages with Marsilius de Padua, who said, let's reinterpret the social contract as a contract of delegation. And that was where the whole democratic tradition grew out of that. And so it was never about simple-minded consent versus coercion. That was a modern reinvention. And you have other political thinkers like Jonathan Israel at the Princeton or School for Advanced Study at Princeton that still thinks it's a big consent is all that was necessary, and just doesn't even see the issue of delegation versus alienation. So that's confusion number 4. And the confusion number 5 is goes back to the medieval idea that the ruler of the land was the ruler because he owned the land. That if you, whatever land you live on, you are under the governance of the owner of the land. And so there's no other governance mechanism necessary, so that rulership and ownership are blended together. And then Marx transferred this idea to industry, saying that whoever owns the means of production is therefore the ruler of production, the governs and manages production. And Marx was dead wrong. And the idea here is that the actual governance over the workers, the bargaining power may be based on the ownership of capital, but the actual legal mechanism is not part of the ownership of capital, which can be borrowed or rented or leased, but is based on the employment contract. And that's the key feature of the conventional firm, is the employment contract. And you can borrow capital, you can lease land, you can lease buildings, et cetera, but the employment contract is where the right to govern in the hands of the employer. And the employer could be a pure entrepreneur that doesn't even own the capital, but it's rented. And so that misconception goes back to medieval times. It was transmitted into modern times by Marx and a boatload of conventional thinkers, and still survives today, that people say, well, they own the capital, therefore they control. And you know, even from your personal property, that you own your house or you own your land, well, that gives you the right to make somebody a trespasser if they come with that. But it doesn't they don't become your slave or your servant just because they're using your land or in your house. So the right you have is the negative right to make them a trespasser, to not give your consent for them to use it, but that is different from you having the discretionary control rights over them, which requires the employment contract in a traditional firm. So these are some of the issues that come into this, and I'm quoting here, I'm not making this up, I'm quoting some of the traditional experts. So this is Otto von Guericke, a 19th century legal scholar in Germany, and his books have been translated and are available. And he gives exactly this theory, that traditional sophisticated defense of monarchy was not based on divine right or right of conquest. It was based upon the pact of subjection, the pactum subjectionis, where the people, either explicitly or by the prescription of time, have agreed to this contract where the ruler gets the right to govern from them. And then he says there in the second quote, so that's the translation, translato imperi, the translation of right to govern to the sovereign. And then he says there at the end, on the other hand, the assumption of a mere concessio imperi. So this is the delegation. Concessio is Latin for delegation, where those who govern as the representative or as the trustee of those who are governed. And that was the basis for democratic theory, the popular sovereignty, as Guericke says. So this is the sort of laying that out, translato versus concessio, or alienation versus delegation, and I think I gave a picture here to sort of picture this. So the idea of the picture starts out the sort of the standard classical liberal analysis, that it's really consent versus coercion. That's the big issue here. And in our society, we have the two major political and economic institutions are both based on consent. Consent in the political sphere, we have political democracy, at least in theory, and in the economic sphere, we have the employment contract, which is also based on consent, and therefore we're both on the same side. Whereas in the past, we had these coercive institutions, slavery, monarchy, and feudalism, and so that's the transition from society based on status to society based on contract, and not even recognizing the difference between a contract of alienation or a contract of delegation. So once you clear up that confusion, then the voluntary side splits into these two parts, with alienation on one side and delegation on the other side. And the sort of obvious fact, which is why normal political science can't talk about this, is that the employment contract is obviously a contract of alienation, that no one dreams that the employer is the representative or the delegate of the employees. So it is the workplace pact of subjection, analogous to the older contracts, and then the political democracy, which is not alienation, that the government in theory is our representatives, and they are trustees for the public thing, the Republic. And so the conventional structure in the firm, based on the employment relationship, is on the opposite side here, is on the alienation side. So this is the picture that you won't find in any conventional political theory textbook, because it obviously has the wrong conclusions that political democracy and the employment relationship, although both based on consent, are based on very different things. One is an alienation and one is a delegation. So this is what cannot be said, and I mean, I'm just stunned by the fact that very few political scientists, and I'm not even talking about economists, forget economists, political scientists, with exception of present company and Robert Dahl and a few others don't even want to talk about it. I mean, it's really the fact that what people do all day long is based upon an alienation contract. And the idea of self-government is something we apply in theory to the overall political sphere, but don't apply it to the human organizations where people spend most of their day. And it's just a stunning thing. And in the future, people will look back, the way we look back at the people who were the intellectuals in the times of slavery and say, what were they thinking? You know, they wrote books on justice and books on this and that, and never really mentioned right under their noses was the whole institution of slavery. And so in the future, people look back and say, you know, this is not a secret that the employer is not the representative of the employees. And this is we had these few different firms where the employees were the members implementing this idea that because they were those who are governed, they should have this right to vote in the firm. But that was really a very marginal thing in our time, and the standard thing, largely unquestioned, in the economics profession, hardly at all, and unquestioned almost entirely in the political science, is this mismatch between our ideals and our principles in the political sphere and in the organizations of our economic life in the workplace. So I give a few quotes here. This is sort of your typical slide that has maybe a little bit too much text on it. But I, you know, I love to quote people, and couldn't figure out what to leave out here. You know, the times in which people really think about something being different are after wars. That if you think about the two private enterprise economies that really have a different structure of the workplace, they're the two countries that lost World War II, Japan and Germany. That each one had to flush out the older ownership that was part of the fascist regimes, and so the workers, almost by default, got rights and governance. So you have that history there in the Japanese firm, wouldn't call it democratic, but certainly paternalistic community where the workers are treated as members in some sense. That is being lost now with the dominance of the American style, Anglo-Saxon style of corporate governance encroaching upon that. And the same story in Germany. Germany was co-determination and the worker council there. So in America and in England, it was the period right after World War I and World War II where people started to think of something different. And this is a quote from Alfred Zimmern, who nobody's ever heard of, probably, maybe Carol. He was one of the founders of the League of Nations and was a political theorist. He's famous for his book on the Greek democracy in ancient Greece. And laid it out there, absolutely clear thinker, in 1918. You know, the contrast between the last bullet point here, between political democracy and industrial autocracy, can't go on. And here we are, you know, almost a century later, having to make the same points again that Alfred Zimmern made at that time. So I highly recommend this book. It's kind of hard to get hold of, but he was a thinker. And then you had World War II, and this chap was writing right after World War II in 1944, Eustace Percy, and he puts it very nicely. He says there's in fact two firms. There is the legal firm, which is the shareholders and the directors, and the shareholders may be completely absentee, have nothing, no human relationship to the firm other than owning this piece of property, the share. And then there's the real firm, the human firm, the people that actually produce the wealth, as economists would say, use up the inputs and produce the outputs. And that human association is not recognized in law. The firm that is recognized in law is the legal firm, the corporate, that is owned by all these shareholders. And so Eustace Percy, who was a conservative in England, says, we have to give law, that last line there, we have to give law to the real association and withdraw meaningless privilege from the imaginary one. And
all in favor?
favor?
So this was in 1944. This was quoted again by George Goiter, 1961, who wrote a book on the Responsible Corporation, a very well-named book. This was called to my attention by Robert Oakeshott, our late colleague in England, and two of the sort of remarkable quotes from British thinkers after the last two wars. So, and there are a few other exceptions. I've been hammering classical liberalism, and who tries to focus everything on consent versus coercion, and since we have consent in the employment contract and consent in the political sphere, but the most prominent, perhaps, of the classical liberals in recent times is James Buchanan, Nobel Prize winner, and basically identified with the Virginia School. He ended up at George Mason, I remember him, I never met him really personally. And when it came time for him to sort of lay down what he thought were the basic principles of a classical liberal order, then you can read them there. And of course, the most basic principles that people should be sovereign, in some sense, over their lives. But he recognized that this was compatible with delegation. Where is it here? Yeah, the second bullet point there, the central premise of individuals as sovereigns does allow the delegation of decision-making authority to agents, so long as it remains understood that the individuals remain as principals. In other words, you are the ones for whom the agents, as your representatives or as your delegates, operate in your name. And so this is a Nobel Prize winning political economist, major figure, and never, to my knowledge, did he ever realize or say in print that this contradicts what goes on every day in the employment relationship, because as we saw, the employment relationship is not a delegation. So you have this sort of intellectual schizophrenia, even when, it's like Thomas Jefferson pinning the Declaration of Independence while he's running a slave plantation. And here you have James Buchanan as this great classical liberal thinker, but enunciating a principle that just totally contradicts the way almost all firms operate, and never, facing the contradiction. And I have a lot of friends on the right, and I hammer them with these things, and they just don't know what to do. It was sort of like we don't want to think about this, and we don't have to think about this, and don't bother me with that, and so forth. So I'm giving you sort of obviously selected quotes from these different thinkers, and so the basic ideas are there even in someone like James Buchanan, who was a very creative thinker and an excellent representative of classical liberalism. So that pretty much is the story. I mostly focused on that first bullet there, the argument for some sort of worker-owned firm from the political theory, from the democratic theory side, inalienable right. Of course, when you rule out the contract for alienation, then the right is called inalienable. And there is a whole parallel argument that's much more technical about the property rights involved, applying the basic principle of people getting the fruits of their labor, positive and negative, and which is the same as the sort of legal principle of holding people legally responsible for both the good and the bad that they do. And that's a more technical argument, and you can get that in my other writings. But when you put the two principles together, then you see that this whole debate that dominated much of the 20th century, that the firm is a piece of property and we're going to debate whether it's privately owned or state-owned, is totally a false framing of the issues. And in fact, the basic principles of democracy and the basic principles of private property, which is grounded on getting the fruits of your labor, both point in the direction and in fact demand the legal structure of a democratic firm, a firm which implements this idea that the members of the firm are the people working in the firm, and then you have these various different ways that you can try to arrive at that sort of firm under different legal structures. Thank you.
Okay, let's invite and welcome Carol Pagan from UCLA to respond to David. We're going to hear from Joseph Blasi after Carol in place of Robert Hocken. A little bit. What did you say? Announcement. Oh, announcement. Okay.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank everyone concerned for inviting me here today. This is very informative to listen to David. Well, I first became acquainted with David's work, I think it was sort of around about the mid to late 80s. Well, no, probably the mid-80s, actually. That was when I was writing the Sexual Contract, which some of you here may not even have heard of, given that I'm coming from a very different direction to all this. And I'm very pleased that Chris mentioned my first book, Participation and Democratic Theory, because that was about democratizing the workplace. And I haven't really come back to that in exactly that way, but what I have been interested in, and what was actually in the sexual contract, was an argument about the employment contract. Only that's all treated as a feminist book, which it was, but most people just ignore what I had to say about the employment contract. And I was actually rather pleased with it, so it's been sort of aggravation. But anyway, that's really where David and my work intersects mostly, but also somewhat on the ownership question too, because it did occur to me that actually in Participation and Democratic Theory, I didn't actually talk about ownership. What I was interested in was democratizing the authority structure. And actually, that's what I've been interested all along, right up to the present day. So that's the kind of continuity that I see as holding everything I've done together, but I don't know how many other people actually see it that way. Probably not many of them. So what I did for today, I was very interested in another paper, a new paper of 2015 that David had on the papers we had access to, called On Renting of Persons. So I'll say something about that and about the intersection of our work. And I think I might actually have a little bit of a criticism there, David. Usually we're pretty much in agreement, although we arrived at all this from such different directions, which is quite fascinating actually. So this is where I think David has. Well, actually, I should apologise. I'm afraid I don't have any slides. Since I became emeritus, I'm very gradually trying to slow down. And that means actually a ton of stuff never gets done, so I'm afraid I can get around to the slides. So I think David has made a major contribution in his critique of the institution of employment and the employment contract. I mean, as he's been saying, so few other people actually ever criticise it. So I think that's an absolutely major thing, that he sees the employment contract and not ownership as central to the authority structure, and which means the authority structure of capitalism, basically, given that employment is so crucial to the whole edifice. And he's also one of the few scholars who really understands the logic of libertarianism, or whatever you want to call it, classic liberalism, or as I called it in the sexual contract, contractarianism. And that has some interesting implications. And also also something he talks about in the latter part of these slides, is that the history of political argument contains these neglected arguments about contract and consent, which actually, as he illustrated, provides a basis for the criticism of the employment contract. And, as he's been saying to us, of course, that's precisely why it's not taken up, and it's just left as ignored. It's too hard to deal with, because nobody wants to go down that road. Particularly now, actually. I mean, it's got worse rather than better. It's just taken, employment is just taken for granted as essential to the modern economy and society. And in the last 30 years, I mean, labour markets and so employment have been spread globally, what we call globalisation, and into areas of the world and into parts of social life where we've never existed before. We've now got more employment than we ever had. So it's quite a difficult problem. And another feature of David's work that I really appreciate is that he always writes extremely clearly. No jargon, no made-up words. And I say this because, my background, what I do, except I interpret it quite widely, is political theory. And political theory over the last, I don't know what it is, 20 years, something like that, has just become infested with impenetrable, unreadable prose. And so it's such a treat to find someone like David who writes in good English, so you can understand it, what he says, which is more than you can do with a lot of political theory now. So usually I don't find work by economists very interesting or useful, and so David is a very big exception here. One little thing we don't agree on is use of the term wage slavery, which I found quite useful for a whole range of reasons, which I'll come to in a moment. And David avoids that one. So when I encountered David's work for the first time, and it was one of his essays, I didn't actually know it was him, and so I shall tell you about that. This was at a point, I've done a lot of work on theories of original contracts, and at this point I was thinking about two of them in particular, Samuel Pufendorf and John Locke. And I was very curious about the strong conviction that there is a very sharp dividing line between free labour, exemplified by employment, and unfree labour, exemplified, of course, by slavery. And it seemed to me that this dividing line was rather more flimsy than people wanted to believe and did believe. And there's great emphasis on this contract for a limited time, employment, and unlimited labour, slavery. And a couple of things that were quite important is now Pufendorf is very interesting because he has this nice story or conjectural history about the origin of slavery, and he argues that it began in a contract. He says that men of the poorer condition saw it to their advantage to enter into a contract with the richer people to be their slaves. And so they'd be looked after for life. So they got protection and provision in return for their labour for a lifetime. And that was slavery. Nothing about coercion. A contract. And then, of course, there was Robert Nozick's book, which David has taken quite an interest in, Anarchy's
State and Utopia.
State and Utopia. I can't remember the titles anymore. And this was a libertarian book, and it became extremely popular and extremely influential in political theory and political philosophy. But his supporters tended rather to overlook the fact that he argues that in a truly free political system, then individuals would be allowed to sell themselves into slavery. That one was kind of put under the carpet at the standard points. You can't sell yourself into slavery, you mustn't sell your votes, and so on. And David took quite an interest in that. So the employment contract I've seen as the major example of a voluntary contract between juridical equals, and which has the consequence that one party becomes subordinate to the other. The workers become subordinate to the employer. And this is through this free contract. So it was while I was thinking about all this that I came across an article by one Fillmore, someone named Fillmore who I'd never heard of. And I had no idea until quite some years later when David wrote an essay that actually came out, as it were, as the real author of this paper. But this was quite influential on my thinking at that point, because Fillmore took libertarianism to its logical conclusion, laid the whole thing out. And he argued that in a quote, civilized contractual slavery isn't anything more than the extension of the employment contract to a lifetime. So, why shouldn't we just extend it? And he also argued that any decisive counter-argument to this kind of voluntary slavery would also apply to the employment contract, and that, of course, would be a reductio ad absurdum. So that, we couldn't do that. So this helped me fit quite a number of pieces of my thinking around these questions into place at the time, and helped me formulate a couple of categories that I use in the sexual contract, which was one category was civil slavery, precisely the extension of the employment contract to a lifetime, only civil slavery, because this takes place, where formally at least we're all free and we're all equal and so on, and civil subordination. Again, the same sort of society, but that's the employment contract of the limited duration, what we've got. So that was my first encounter with David's work. And then I made more use of his arguments a bit later in a paper I published in 2002, which was on the two concepts of self-ownership, which had become very popular in a certain genre of political theory, and property in the person, which is the concept I favour and have made use of, and I'll explain why. So this all comes into on the renting of persons, the other paper that's available to us, and there's something in that which I'm wondering whether we disagree about it, whether his argument's a little too strong, and so it'd be nice to hear what you think of this, David. So this is David's arguments. So the argument we've heard this morning. The employer's right to tell workers what to do, to give them orders, to set their tasks, doesn't arise out of ownership. It arises out of the employment contract. The ownership gives you the right to expel trespassers, but it doesn't give you the right to tell other people what to do. No legal authority over the workers. Now, where I'm not sure whether we're agreeing or not, is how you discuss what goes on in the employment contract. So David's argument in this paper is that when workers enter the employment contract, what they're alienating is their capacity for responsible action. And legally, they become as if they were non-adults or even non-persons. And that's the bit I'm wondering about. As he says in the paper, and the example he's used very aptly before, the example of the criminous worker, where we find the capacity for responsible action isn't alienating. You know, if the employer and the worker engage in something criminal, then the worker is held to be responsible as well. And David's argument is that the law counts the worker's obedience to the employer's orders as fulfilling the contract. So obedience is crucial. And he says there's a legal system that, and I quote, accepted such contracts was only a legalised fraud on an institutional scale. Quite a nice little phrase, that one. Now, so the question I'm not concerned about is, does the worker, even as if, what he calls, I'm quoting, the legal role of a non-adult? Now, I don't know about actual employment law, but, and I'm sure there are some forms of employment where this is the case. I mean, particularly where it involves non-white workers. I mean, think of all those immigrant workers busily working away in Qatar, building the stuff for the next World Cup. Slaves, basically. But my question is it generally the case in 2015 that this is what is alienating and that workers are as if they're non-adults? I'm not sure we need to go that far, the non-adult part, when we have a system that formally at least we're all individually free and individually equal to each other. I mean, I think my argument would be rather that the worker is certainly a subordinate, but the workers remain adults. They're subordinates because they follow the orders of somebody else. They can't make these decisions themselves. But do they? I don't think this is to be adults. I don't know that we have to actually have that. I mean, adults as well as non-adults can be obedient. And I think that now that the institution of employment is seen as, and is largely accepted as, the sort of natural order of the world, we don't really think about this question of why adults are obedient. I'll leave you with that one. So the question I've always been worrying away at is how and why employment, which has all its subordinates, can be so widely viewed as the quintessential example of free labour. And especially because in a lot of the 19th century and the early 20th century, there were plenty of critics of it. From many different political backgrounds, actually. All sorts of people criticised employment, but nobody criticises employment today, as David has said. Now, one answer, and this is an answer that comes into his contract and, consent and coercion argument, and this is important in the libertarian arguments, is, well, the worker enters the employment contract quite freely, and so consents to what the consequences of entering the contract are. But I think that's a bit too quick because it still leaves this question of what is being rented, contracted out, alienated, and so on. So my answer to this one brings ownership back in, but at a different level, not the level that David's been talking about it. And this is where another point in my work where a paper of David's was very crucial. And this was about John Locke. And I'm sure everybody's familiar with the passage in Locke where he argues that the turf that the servant has cut belongs to the master and not the servant, even though the servant has cut it. And what David pointed out is that the general way of interpreting that passage is it's talking about the labour that the servant has performed. And so it becomes kind of odd. I mean, why there's this puzzle. Why doesn't the turf belong to the servant, particularly given what Locke says about labour and so on. And what David argues is that Locke is not talking about performing the labour at all. He's talking about labour that's owned. Because the servant has temporarily alienated the use of his labour to his master. And so, of course, the turf belongs to the master, because he is, for this period of time, the owner of the servant's labour. Now, what Locke also writes very famously is that every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. So, what has the servant alienated? Well, my argument, I stick to the letter of Locke on this one. What the servant has alienated is a piece of this property that he owns in his person. You can kind of think of the person as a bundle of bits of property of all different kinds. And in this case, the servant has temporarily alienated use of his services, or his labour, to his master. But then he gets it back at the end of it, unless he's unfortunate to be on call 24 hours a day. But this one, he just cut the turf. And so this differentiates the slave and the servant, because if you're just alienating, renting out, contracting out this piece of property in your person, and your person remains as before, no detriment to your person, unlike slavery, where your person is handed over or coerced over. And so that means, sorry, there's something flying about it. That means that in our society, leaving Locke's behind, we have the worker juridically free and equal to the individual or potential employer, and he's doing, roughly speaking, what the Locke's servant did. He's contracting out this piece of property or in his person, his services, for the temporary use of the employer. And so then it's used as the new owner wills and not its proper owner, as it were. So employment can be presented as free labour. The individual just rents out a piece of his property for a certain period, and this person is the same as before. Now, the problem with that one, of course, is exactly what David says about responsible action. In fact, you can't alienate people. Well, there are some bits you can actually literally alienate the property of your person, but your services are not of that kind. You can't send these abstract services off to the workplace. You have to go there if they're going to be useful, if the employer is actually going to employ them as he wants to. So you have to go there. And once you're there, then you also have to use your talents and your capacities and your experience, including your capacity for responsibility, to actually do what the employer wants you to, notwithstanding the fact that you've been said to just merely alienate a piece of property, or your services are not your person. Or given that, as David emphasises in his work, that you're seen as just another factor of production from one perspective. So I think that the old paradox of slavery is lurking in there. And another way of looking at it, of course, is that fits in with David's presentation, is that what you're actually alienating is not your services, but your right of individual self-government, and your right of collective government as well. That's what's being alienated. So I think this political fiction of property in the person does really explain, at least help explain, how and why employment can be seen as free labour at all. Because you're just services. And subordination then is conjured into freedom. And it suggests that, particularly in the 21st century, there's no need, even as if legally, for workers to be seen as non-adults. Adults can do all this. And I think the idea of property in the person, this idea as the individual as owner of himself and all the pieces of himself, I mean, for a very long period, this all referred to men, but now, the worker, obviously, these days is just as likely to be a woman, but there's no need for any other fictions. This is a very powerful political fiction, I think, because today, and especially when it's translated into the language of self-ownership rather than property in the person, you can find it in many arguments by political philosophers, by leftist arguments, in feminist arguments, and I think it's actually at the basis, usually unspoken, of the doctrine, the economic doctrine ideology that we now call neoliberalism, which has been extending contract and property and commodification to ever more areas of our lives. And I think it's hard to explain without the idea of property in the person how, for example, genetic materials from individuals can come to be patented. How do they become somebody's private property? And why is there this large market, albeit a lot of it underground, for bodily organs? Well, are bits of your property in your person that can literally be alienated and are being, if a lot of the reports you read in very nasty circumstances, extracted from some people for the use of others. So that's why I think it's so important. And just one little thing, listening to David on, I don't know, that was very interesting, it was stuff about the structure of workers' co-ops. But from my point of view, the real importance is for democracy. Because at the moment what we've got is this institution of employment, which is so large and so important for everybody's life. And yet this is undemocratic, completely. And it's the thing people write all these books and articles about democratic theory, and it's hardly ever mentioned. So I think workers' co-ops are really important here, because in a co-op the workers are not employed. Not in the sense I've been talking about. I mean, of course they're working, but not as employed. They're members, they're partners, they're citizens, whatever term you want to use in their enterprise. And so you don't, to use David's language in the slides, there can be delegation, but there's not alienation. You can delegate your right of self-government if it's a very big enterprise. You can delegate, have some delegated rights of self-government, but not alienate it. And also, you keep when you go to your enterprise, you keep your personal rights, you keep your citizenship rights, which of course are abrogated under employment quite often. And so democracy replaces employment, and I think that's a really crucial thing for me about workers' co-ops. And I want to conclude by thanking David for all these stimulating arguments over the years, which I've found quite crucial at certain points in my thinking. And also, the other thing I noted, but we had an excellent example of it here in the slides, is all your apt quotations that you found for us, which you find through lots of your books and articles. I mean, it's such a wide range. I must say, I'm not terribly well acquainted with Zimmern, but I'm certainly going to look that up, and that's very, very useful. So, thank you.
We're 12:16, so we have 15 minutes left. If you want to give a quick response to Carol's question, she hoped you would, and then we can open it up. We might get a little exchange on it.
The other commentator hasn't shown up?
No, he has not shown up. He's still somewhere in California.
Yeah, I should just clarify that story about Fillmore. It might not have been obvious. This was in the late 70s that Robert Nozick, this professor of philosophy at Harvard, published this book saying we should allow voluntary slavery and voluntary giving up of your political rights. And he was one of the two major philosophers at Harvard, so this was not some marginal figure. And I couldn't figure out at first how to answer this. I mean, so I said, well, maybe the way to answer it is to write a spoof, to write a satirical article. I'm from Missouri, where Mark Twain is from, and so I thought satire may be the way to answer it. So I wrote an article pretending that I was a super Nozickian. It was entitled "The Libertarian Case for Slavery, a Note on Nozick." And that's the article that Carol was referring to. So the whole idea was to say that the civilized voluntary slavery contract is of a piece of the employment contract. It's simply a difference in the tenure, which is a point made, of course, by the slave owners themselves, that they said, we don't care to own your soul. Souls don't chop cotton. Labor chops cotton. And where is it that labor is not for sale? And the only difference is in the tenure. So I made this point, giving all the quotes from the pro-slavery writers, which has been totally suppressed by intellectual history. That as I pointed out, that paper she referred to on the Dropbox. You have, I think I found 4 collections of by modern historians of the intellectual history of the pro-slavery argument. And it's like 15 people in one, and 17 in another, and 11 in another, and not a single one has a representative of this traditional theory that slavery is contractual. And there were. I mean, there's the American representative of that school is named Samuel Seabury, Reverend Samuel Seabury. His grandfather was the man who brought Episcopalianism to America, considered the founder of the American Episcopalian Church. So it's a famous family, and he wrote this book on the case, I forget the exact title, natural law case, and then all your traditional political thinkers, John Locke, Montesquieu, Blackstone, not to mention Pufendorf, and that whole tradition, all recognized the voluntary contract for slavery. So you have this modern intellectual historians who refuse to recognize that tradition, that think that the only argument for slavery was coercion and racism and feudalism, so forth, whereas there were liberal defenders of slavery, classical liberal natural law thinkers, that yes, we have this natural right to liberty and we can sell it, like we can sell a pair of shoes. So Fillmore picked up on that whole tradition, quoted it, and said that I'm sort of filling in the backstory to this Harvard professor, the great Professor Nozick. And my idea was to try, I didn't mention any of the animal rights arguments, which were the real answer to this. And the idea was to try to force people to think through the animal rights arguments, because they shouldn't have been so horrified by this argument for slavery. And it wasn't easy to get that published, let me tell you. I was, got my graduate degrees at Boston University, and I knew the editor to the journal there. They'd been rejected by 5 or 6 journals, and didn't want to publish it. So finally, I was in his office and sort of challenged his manhood, saying, I don't think you've got the cojones to publish this piece. You've got this, lefty journal, and you're going to publish an argument for slavery. And I said, give me the piece. And we went around and around. And so finally I said, okay, I'll give you the piece, but don't tell the referees that it's a spoof. And he said, okay. So I sent it off to the referee, and the referee sent it back. Said, I disagree with everything this says, but it's so well argued, I think you got published. So that's how it got published. It was an inside deal. And no one responded to it in the proper way of trying to figure out how to defeat these arguments, except Carol. Carol was the only one in this book, The Sexual Contract. You should take a look at the book. It's become a classic in the feminist literature, and where she shows that these contracts to alienate how they are inherently invalid. So everybody else, and Carol, you didn't realize it was a spoof at the time, did you?
No.
Yeah. So nobody has realized it was a spoof.
Because it's so logical.
Yeah. And American libertarianism is so crazy, it's hard to be satire. And this was Mark Twain's famous observation, that good satire, nobody knows it's satire. So that's how, when I was finally coming out of the closet and publishing it in a collection of essays under my own name, then I sent an email to Carol and said, we haven't met, but I'm actually Fillmore, and Fillmore, by the way, the name is the name of an anti-slavery pseudonym. The most radical anti-slavery pamphlets in the 1700s were by somebody in England named J. Fillmore, and so if the scholars of anti-slavery thought knew it was a pseudonym, like David Bryan Davis at Yale, but everybody else that read it just read it straight up. So there's Nozick and there's Fillmore. And so it was a interesting, amusing episode in the sort of American debate. I mean, Europeans are just horrified by all this talk, but in debate, this was considered as a legitimate paper, and there were 2 papers published in the same journal later on that agreed with it. One of them said, yes, we should allow this, but we don't need it in the first world, we need it in the third world. Third world is where people should be able to sell themselves into slavery. So the basic argument about alienability is that's sort of the other part of this argument that I didn't get a chance to go into. But the basic idea goes back to the Stoics, and the Stoics said that people are not slaves in their soul, they're slaves in their body. And so this idea that somehow behind the institution of slavery, you still have these people that have the free will, they're physically coerced. But they have this free will. And this idea basically went underground through conscience. And the inalienability of conscience was that you are responsible for your religious beliefs, and that you cannot alienate that to your priest or to your pope or to your church, because even if you try to, that in effect is your decision. So if you say, I'll believe whatever the pope says, that's still your decision. So you, in fact, cannot alienate your responsibility for the results of your theological beliefs. You should read the Bible and so forth. So this idea re-emerged in Luther. Luther was no great liberator, but he certainly put this idea back on the table. And then it descended through the Enlightenment, through Spinoza on the continent, and through Francis Hutchinson in the Scottish Enlightenment, and was turned into the theory of inalienable rights. So the notion of the language of inalienable rights comes from Francis Hutchinson, who was Adam Smith's teacher and the previous holder of the chair in moral philosophy at Glasgow that Smith took over. And it was, of course, Hutchinson that influenced Jefferson. So that's where Jefferson got this idea and put it into the sort of Declaration of Independence, the political rhetoric of the founding of our nation. So that's that tradition. And the points that I'm making is that inalienability is not a matter of time, that you cannot alienate your responsibility for your actions for 8 hours a day any more than you can for a lifetime. And so the counter-argument is not about consent, it's about that you cannot do this, that is treating you as a non-person. I would say non-adult, I should say non-person, because in the employment contract you have, as any factor supplier, go back to economic language, you have zero liability for the cost of the enterprise, and you have zero ownership of the product of the enterprise. You are a supplier of a factor. In this case, the factor is labor. So the enterprise, the employer, has the liability to you to pay for your labor, that's your wage and benefits. But so you have zero legal liability for the costs that you create by your work, and zero legal ownership of whatever you produce. And that's the role of an instrument. And it doesn't matter whether the work was 8 hours a day or for a lifetime. So that's the argument. And so you see the intellectual heritage of the argument coming through the Enlightenment, inalienability of conscience. But it's basically saying you remain a person. You know, people are responsible de facto. The law treats it as if your responsibility was alienated because you don't get those liabilities. But in the sort of firm we're talking about, employee-owned firm, the people in the firm are the ones that are liable jointly for the cost of the firm, and they own the product of the firm. So that's not an employment relationship, even though the law may, however, the law classifies it. But the reality is that that's not an employment relationship. You are a member of the firm, you're a citizen of the firm, or whatever language you want to choose. And so the real question here is this sort of membership that we usually talk about in terms of ownership, or is it an employment relationship? And this is that history of the critique of the employment relationship as alienating that which is inalienable. And so that's just to fill in.
I would like to alienate my responsibility for what happens in the next 2 minutes to Professor Joseph Wasn't. And I guess thank you, everybody.
I just want to thank David and Carol for being here and for, as you can see, enormous, thoughtful preparation. We started these body of work talks to celebrate people who were really making fundamental contributions over many decades of work. In this case, celebrating David. But it's about time that Carol's work and impact on the whole field has been endorsed and confirmed. And so really we're celebrating both of them today. And thank you very much for taking the time to come. And David, thank you for all your contributions. So we salute both of them. Just a few minor announcements. First of all, I'd like to thank Nancy and my son, Teddy Bonus Blasi, who was our videographer today. Thank you, Tim. Secondly, in my continuing attempt to restructure the mentoring sessions through repeated failure, Karen's idea is now this. The mentoring will take place in the snack room. So those who want some mentoring and feedback, sit down at a table, and maybe you can even put your name tag out, and all of us will come in there and probably give feedback. 3 times to keep in mind as we wrap up. After lunch, we start the next and last session at 1:30. And then we will have the group picture outside this auditorium at 3 o'clock from the photographer, Jamie. And then at 3:30 we will start the mentoring sessions. And then you have the schedule for dinner. Dinner tonight will be a celebration on the 15th floor penthouse of the apartment building where you're living, and not in the dining room. So thank you very much. Have a good lunch. And thank you again, David and Carol.
Thank you, Teddy.